Welcome to tonight's webinar. Tonight we're going to be going through the second half of the CMP. If you didn't get the first half, you can ask us about that. We will make that available at some time in the future. But anyway, let's get started right into it. We've got a lot of material to cover. You know, when we talked about last time, one of the things we really hit, oops, sorry about that. One of the things we really hit upon, the importance when you're looking at blood work of really trying to understand patterns. I'm going to go ahead and put my camera on so you can see me when I've said, there you go. Okay, so one of the things I really want to make a big point about, when you read blood work, you always want to think in patterns. And patterns can be certainly when you're looking at blood. In other words, if you see elevated cholesterol, if you see elevated AST, ALT, if you see elevated, or decreased BUN, whatever, these can all be a pattern that shows us there's something going on with the liver. But when you look at patterns reading blood, it's a lot more than just looking at different analytes. You want to start with the history, the observation history, and the examination. Put everything together so you can start piecing it together so you understand the full picture when you're taking a look. That's one of the pitfalls, I'll say, to a lot of different things I've seen in functional medicine, is that sometimes because the labs are so good and we have so many specialty labs out there, there's a tendency to go straight to the specialty labs or straight to the blood work and really kind of just go past the history and the exam. I encourage you to put that all together because it really does give you some very fruitful information. So we have something called the clinical decision-making tree. Now we're going to go through all this blood. I just want to hit this real quick just for a minute. But when somebody comes in, they present as a patient here. We have them do intake forms. We do the observation. We talked about those before. And then we link their metabolic issues to the presenting symptoms. So we start taking a look at them. Maybe somebody comes in, they're shaped like an apple, and that's one of the indications of insulin resistance. Then you start asking them questions. You have them fill out a form. They say things like they get tired after the noontime meal, which is a very characteristic sign of insulin resistance. And you look at and you see, dark pigmentation behind the neck or on the axillary region, which is acanthos nigricans. Maybe you see some skin tags. These are all consistent with insulin resistance. So that's part of a pattern that you've already started before you even take a look at that patient. Now, if I have that patient come in, then I'm going to, in addition to my regular testing, blood testing, I'm going to order an insulin as well, because I don't want to know what the insulin's doing because it's part of that pattern. So that's what I wanted to really emphasize, is we build this clinical decision-making tree. Everything builds on the next thing. And so by the time we get there, we have a more complete picture. And that really keeps us, okay, so wait a second. So that really keeps us from making mistakes, if you will, when it comes to our ability to not just go random, do this, do that, and so on and so forth, without having a rationale. Because when it comes down to it, the more difficult cases you see, you really want to know where you're at all the time. You want to know what you've done, what your strategy is, why you've done it, why you're there, and so on and so forth. So anyway, I just encourage you at that point. Let's move forward here. Okay, so this is just part of the, reading the exams and so forth. Let's get into it. Okay, all right, so before, when we did the CMP, we talked about the glucose. We talked about a lot of ins and outs about the glucose. We went pretty deep into that, which I think that was pretty good. I went back and looked at that. There's a lot of great information in there. We also talked about the BUN, the creatinine. We talked about these factors as well. What we're going to start talking about right now are the electrolyte patterns. These are your sodium, your potassium chloride, and your carbon dioxide. So let's get right into it. First, sodium is a great place to see. You're going to see a lot of information off of the sodium. When you see sodium in the blood, keep in mind, we look at our patterns, observation, history, physical exam, and we don't just rush to the sodium. But when you see the sodium that's elevated or lower, either one is going to give us a clue. It's an invitation for us to look for patterns. So if you look from a clinical range, you're going to see a lot of times that they say that, depending on your lab, about 135 to 145 is actually considered normal for you in the clinical range. But we have a homeostatic range or a healthy range, functional range, that's more akin to 140 to 144. Now, let's talk just a little bit about sodium, and I'm going to go through some ins and outs about this. So the most abundant cation in extracellular space. All right, so let's take a look. First, we have a cell right here. Inside the cell, we have a whole bunch of potassium, which actually carries a positive charge. On the outside of the cell, we have a whole bunch of sodium, which holds a positive charge. You also have some chloride out here as well. But the predominant electrolytes between, as a matter of fact, 90% of your potassium is actually going to be found intracellular, where the majority or lion's share of your sodium is going to be extracellular. So I've got a question right down here. I want to go ahead and make sure that I don't have any problems with what I'm doing here. Doc, question the levels of creatinine and BO. Okay, so that's a different question for a different day. I just wanted to make sure that nothing was wrong with how the recording was coming out. Okay, so the potassium, 90% of it is inside the cell, and sodium, most of it's outside. Now, in order for cells to function, we have to have a balance in polarity. Now, you could ask, well, sodium's positive and potassium's positive. How does this work? Well, most of your proteins are actually inside the cell. So since protein is inside the cell, the protein carries a negative charge, and there's so much protein in the cell that it counterbalances the potassium. So really you get this nice polarity between the negative protein, and sodium. So when those begin to equal, you get more sodium in, and so on and so forth, then you can get to the place where now the cell is depolarized, and then actions happen. So there's an action potential that happens because of this. That creates an electrical potential on the membrane itself. And when the membrane has electrical potential, that gives it energy to be able to bring nutrients in the cell, if you will, in very basic form, and actually to get waste products out. So it's really important for these to be in the normal place. Now, one of the things that we see when we look at sodium is this. The organ that really has the highest responsibility, if you will, for, here's the brain and the brainstem, nose and the mouth. The organ that really helps you retain sodium is going to be the adrenal glands. And if you remember, the adrenal glands are above the renals, the kidneys. And so the adrenal glands, their major job is to do a few things. One thing, of course, they kick out cortisol. So the adrenals kick out cortisol. Cortisol is called a stress hormone. Why is cortisol called a stress hormone? Well, because cortisol modulates three main functions in the body. It does more than this, but these are kind of the three big hits, if you will, of what cortisol does. Cortisol modulates blood sugar. It modulates blood pressure, and it modulates the immune system. Now, I'll give you an example of how this is used practically. When we look at the brain, the two elements that the brain needs for fuel in order for it to function is that it has to have an adequate amount, a reliable source of glucose and oxygen. These are the two things that the brain really needs for energy. If you're on a ketogenic diet, you bypass this. But for everybody that's not on a ketogenic diet, glucose and oxygen are part of the neuron theory. It is what the brain uses for fuel. I'm using this as an explanation because cortisol is called a stress hormone. The reason why it's called a stress hormone is because when you get under stress, and I don't just mean emotional stress, this could also be physiological stress, trauma stress. When you get under stress, what do you need? You need fuel for the brain. If you don't have fuel from the brain, it's very difficult to deal with the stress. So what does your body do? Your body, when under stress, physiological stress, emotional stress, physical stress, chemical stress, whatever the stress is, your adrenals will kick out cortisol so you can very quickly get glucose and oxygen to the brain. That's your adaptation. That's how you deal. That's how you deal with stress. So the adrenals also help you retain sodium. So the adrenals help you retain sodium through, remember the hormone called aldosterone. So there's a hormone called aldosterone that comes from the adrenal glands, from the cortex of the adrenal glands, the same cortex that produces cortisol, a little different area, but same, it's in the cortex there. This is what's going to release aldosterone. When aldosterone is released, it goes down to the kidneys, and then as the blood is being filtered through the kidneys through this glomerular filtration system, you're going to hold on to the sodium. You're not going to release it through the urine, and therefore you retain it. So sodium is a very important molecule, as we said, because it has to do with electrolyte balance. We have to have a good electrolyte balance. And I went through all of this to get to this point, that one thing that can happen, we talked last time about this, when somebody's having low blood sugar, or let's say reactive hypoglycemia. When you have reactive hypoglycemia, this is just one example, I can give you some more, but when you have reactive hypoglycemia, what happens is the brain recognizes there's not enough fuel to run it. So what it does through the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, it sends an alarm in the form of ACTH, an alarm to the adrenals, so you have cortisol, so you can get sugar more rapidly to the brain. So when this loop goes on, when somebody has low blood sugar, and let's say that differently, when somebody has reactive hypoglycemia that they're dealing with day in and day out, day in and day out, what happens is this neural loop, this neural feedback loop actually will begin to fatigue. And when it does fatigue, one of the things that can be a victim of that will be the release of aldosterone. When you can't make the aldosterone because your neuroadrenal loop is fatigued, now your sodium will begin to drop. So when we look at this, this is what's called the cortisol shunt. So what happens is acetyl-CoA it produces cholesterol. Cholesterol goes to the adrenals and is converted into pregnenolone. Pregnenolone, the mother of all hormones, if you will, is supposed to go down this pathway where it's going to make androstenedione, which ultimately is going to lead to testosterone, estrogen, and those hormones. Well, pregnenolone is also going to go this way down to progesterone. This is not the progesterone that we think of progesterone. This is actually 17-hydroxyprogesterone, and it goes down, and that's where you make cortisol. Another thing pregnenolone does is it'll go down and it'll actually make aldosterone going down this pathway. So there's one of three things that when cholesterol goes to the adrenals, makes pregnenolone, you're going to get one of three products. You're either going to get your androstenediones, you're going to get your sex hormones, you are going to get a production of cortisol, or you're going to get a production of aldosterone. Now, if you go down this pathway so many times and you're cooking out that cortisol at that level, what happens is you will begin to create what's called a cortisol shunt, and that cortisol shunt will do this. Instead of going down these other pathways, it will preferentially go this way. Down here, you'll make cortisol, and then you'll even get to the point where you can't even make the cortisol efficiently, but you're still jamming down this pathway, even though you're not able to really produce the cortisol. And that's when the aldosterone wanes. And by the way, you can also have some hormonal deficits in that area as well. So that is a pattern that we'll see. One of the things we look at when we look at sodium, we like to see the sodium about 140. Actually, a really nice range is about 140 to 142. I don't generally start getting too excited about sodium until it gets to about 144, but nonetheless, 140 is the cutoff. Once you go below 140, even to 139, this is an indicator that the adrenals can be beginning to fatigue. Can be other reasons for low sodium you want to make sure you look into. One could simply be somebody's on a diuretic. So you want to check that. So somebody could be on a diuretic. They could have edema for another reason, for some other reason. Maybe they were a burn victim or something like that. Maybe they have a bladder infection, a UTI, and they're having swelling, or maybe they're having kidney issues and they're having swelling. Maybe they have congestive heart failure and they're having swelling, edema. Well, these can also drop your sodium. So you want to keep that in mind in your pattern. I do want to show you one more thing about this in regards to the sodium level. Okay, so let's look at our kidney, and above here is the adrenal glands. And I want to go down that road we were just talking about with the reactive hypoglycemia, because reactive hypoglycemia is a chronic insult on the neuroadrenal axis. So it's a chronic insult, and therefore it's causing stress on this mechanism over and over, day in and day out. Like if you have emotional stress, I mean, if you're holding on to that emotional stress and you have baggage, unforgiveness, anger, or whatever the case may be, certainly this is going to tax the adrenals as well. This can do the same thing. But I want to watch, and you can put any of that into the equation I'm talking about. But let's say you have reactive hypoglycemia and you go through this. I want to talk about something that's really important that can be overlooked, and that is this, that we have an autonomic nervous system, okay? Autonomic nervous system. Now, here is the GI tract, here's the brain stem, and here's the vagus nerve that goes between. This is called the brain-gut, gut-brain axis. So the brain-gut, gut-brain axis is the major driver of the autonomic nervous system, and thus it's the major driver of the physiology of the body. So 90% of the brain's energy is really directed towards regulating the autonomic nervous system. Now, there's different parts of the brain, like the limbic system, the orbital frontal area. There's different areas of the brain that can, hypothalamus, that can have influence over the autonomic nervous system. But the brain-gut axis, gut-brain axis, is primarily what's driving it. And as you can remember, as we've gone through this before, that the autonomic nervous system uses the immune system, it uses the endocrine system, and it uses the nervous system as its three systems that give the body balance. D.D. Palmer called it tone. We call it homeostasis, your ability to adapt to the environment, which is largely your ability to be healthy and alive, is all dependent upon the autonomic nervous system. Now, I said all that because I'm getting to a point, and that is this. If you continue to ding, you've got low sodium, and it's because you have a neuroadrenal axis that's fatigued, I want you to think about this. What that means is this mechanism has gone over and over and over. Now your cortisol is waning, and because your cortisol is waning, guess what you can't do? Now you're having a harder and harder time to maintain blood sugar, because remember, cortisol modulates blood sugar. When your cortisol goes down, you're going to have lower blood sugar, right? So the next mechanism will begin to take place, and that's this. The midbrain will communicate with the middle part of the adrenal, the medulla of the adrenal, and kick out epinephrine and norepinephrine. What are these? These are highly charged sympathetic nervous system neurotransmitters. So this is the way your sympathetic nervous system reacts in the body. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system acts globally. So in other words, you don't just have a sympathetic dominance in your little finger. When you have a sympathetic dominance, you have these neurotransmitters flying all over the place. Your whole system is upregulated. So the end point is this, is that when we ding this over and over, when we ding this over and over and over, what happens is our autonomic nervous system begins to favor a sympathetic dominance. And this will wear at the body faster. You will age faster. You have more susceptibility to diseases along the way. And so this is a very important thing that we want to address. That's the reason why when somebody comes in and they have sodium that's lower than 140, and if it fits that pattern of a neuroadrenal axis, there's some things that I'm going to do. First, I want to figure out why, what's causing the, usually it's physiological stress, but it could be emotional or physical or trauma or physical. Figure out why that there's chronic stress on this system. That would be a very important thing to do. Let's say, because of our example, it's reactive hypoglycemia. Well, you've got to make sure, they're eating a protein breakfast. I like to use protein shakes, especially in the initial first 3 months of care with them. I want to identify food sensitivities. I don't want them going a long time without eating. And of course, they've got to avoid carbohydrates, which include, starches, honey, these kind of things. And you just walk through that process to improve that. So you're going to work on the blood sugar, but there's something else I want to work on if that sodium is low, because of that's fatiguing. I may, for a short period of time, use, let's say, for instance, an adrenal glandular. Now, if they have low blood pressure along with low blood sugar, then I may also add something like licorice root. Licorice root will help you retain will help you retain cortisol, and it will support, it's a temporary support, if you will, for the neuroadrenal axis until you can get to the reason why there's so much stress on the adrenal axis. I'm going to have this patient take some Celtic sea salt. I want them doing Celtic sea salt because Celtic sea salt, remember that aldosterone is a mineral corticoid. So if you give them a good solid mineral base, which Celtic sea salt, I think is the best as far as the cheapest thing to do. You can do a ketone water, some other things like that. But Celtic sea salt is really good. How I have them do it is have them take a pinch, 30 minutes in water, 30 minutes before breakfast, 15 minutes or so before lunch, and you're good to go. You can even go 10 to 15 minutes before breakfast would be fine. So we're going to use these things, and then I'm going to look and see what their need for magnesium is. Why would I use magnesium in this case? Well, magnesium is a great balancer of a sympathetic nervous system that's run off the rails. If you have somebody that has anxiety, if you have somebody that's sympathetic dominant, you have, maybe their pupils are large, you measure the temperature of their hand to here, and it's over 2 degrees difference. You see other signs and symptoms of a sympathetic dominance, poor digestion or things like that, then you want to think about adding magnesium. It's not the cure, but it will help balance the autonomic nervous system while you can get to why the autonomic nervous system is out of balance. Okay, I hope that was understandable. I actually spent quite a bit of time on that. I do need to move along. Okay, so here's some of the symptoms you'll see if somebody has cortisol shunt: fatigue, weight gain, low libido, low thyroid, decreased gut function, and mood swings. So how many patients do you have that come in that have, 2 or 3 of those? Well, I mean, if you've been doing this work for over 2 weeks, then you probably have, every other patient coming in that has a level of this going on. Okay, so if you see that, you want to work through the patterns and see if it is the neuroadrenal loop, because if it is, it's an invitation to figure out really what's at the root of the person's problem. Okay, so let's talk about potassium. We talked a little bit about it. It's the chief ion that's found intracellular. We talked about that. Hypokalemia, low potassium, leads to weak muscles, especially the heart. Hyperkalemia leads to flaccid, dilated, congested heart cells. So potassium is one thing you don't want to get wrong, right? So potassium is not like sodium. Sodium is retained by aldosterone. We have no mechanism in our body to retain potassium. So if somebody's having a lot of diarrhea, they're throwing up, or they're on a diuretic that doesn't have a potassium, then you want to look at that potassium and make sure that you're okay with it. If you supplement with potassium, and you can, and it's prudent to do that, but if you supplement with potassium, make sure you're rechecking your potassium numbers. In the beginning, I'm going to check it at least monthly to see where it's going, so I can see where the trends are, and then I can understand how much that they really need. Okay, very good. Now I just got a message that my audio just went off. So if somebody could send me a message if they're out there listening, Dr. Annette, if she's out there listening, you could send me a message, or if you could possibly put it in the question box if you're listening. If you can hear this, put it in the question box and just let me know hey, I can hear you, because I can't really see that. Okay. Okay, good. I just got a message that we're going to go. Also, somebody piped in. Thank you. Okay, so concentration inside the cells 15, 20 times higher. You know, our functional range on this is going to be 4 to 4.4. You know, once it goes below 3.5, it is really getting low, and I'm starting to get, you know, more concerned about it. All right, increased in adrenocortical hypofunction, acidosis, and potassium-sparing diuretics. Plasma renin increase in beta blocking drugs. These are things that you can see an increase in potassium. Also increase in bad blood draw. You want to make sure if somebody is doing the blood draw and they're doing what we call fishing. So in other words, they stuck the needle in and they didn't get the drip blood, so they kind of jimmied the needle around till they got the blood. Well, this can be a reason for high potassium. You always want to keep that in mind. Decreased potassium, we talked about that. Diarrhea, adrenocortical hyperfunction, diuretics are common. Now, just so you know, there's something called dandelion root. Dandelion root can actually be used, it's an herb. It is a natural diuretic, but the really cool thing about it is it is a natural diuretic, but it will help you, it doesn't cause you to lose potassium. So if you can use that, and you do need a diuretic for whatever reason, that might be a better option if it takes care of the diuretic problem, or the problem the diuretic would be used for. All right, so chloride exists primarily in the serum. A couple things to say about chloride. We like to see it 100 to 106, pretty much inversely related to carbon dioxide. So it usually varies inversely, as we said. Increased chloride is associated with metabolic acidosis, and decrease is metabolic alkalosis. So there's a lot to do with the acid-base balance that you're seeing. So increased chlorides suggest too much water crossing the membrane, while decreased chloride and albumin indicate a deficiency of water crossing the membrane. You're going to get edema right there. But if you have increased, then what's going to happen is it's going to cause congestion inside the cells. So if cells are congested, they can't get waste products out as well, and they can't get the nutrients in. So higher chlorides are not desirable. Also, when you look at decreased chlorides, I want you to think about this possibility of hypochlorhydria. Why? Because you make HCl from chloride. So if somebody comes in and they have low chloride, then you want to look for patterns. Remember, we talked about patterns. What would be a pattern? Somebody would say on their intake form, or when you ask them, they belch and burp when they eat food. They get bloated immediately when they eat foods. They have bad breath. These can all be signs of low hydrochloric acid. We're going to look at here in a minute if you have low calcium and low protein. Both of those can be patterns of low hydrochloric acid. Any kind of digestive issue really can be a low hydrochloric acid. It's just kind of hard to see it that way. But if you see digestive issues, you always want to think about it. And especially if you have a low chloride, you really want to, you want to pick that up. Use some betaine HCl or something if it's appropriate for that patient. Okay, so decrease in renal function, primary carbon dioxide excess. So sometimes somebody can have, and we'll get to it in just a moment, somebody can have lung problems. And they're just not able to breathe well. So their breathing isn't good, and so they can't get rid of the CO2. When they can't get rid of the CO2, it's going to cause the CO2 to raise. When the CO2 raises, this can actually be a reason for lowering
I lost you.
Okay, CO2. Okay, all right. All right, let me see here. Okay, so
You're back.
carbon dioxide. Okay, so carbon dioxide, remember carbon dioxide carbon dioxide in the blood is actually bicarbonate. In the blood, it's bicarbonate, and it is a major buffer of an acidic environment. So if we have, our pH should be somewhere about 7.35 in the blood to about 7, I think 4.3, I believe that's the number. But the pH, if we can get that pH in the sweet spot, that's where we're in the best place. But when somebody has chronic inflammation, what does chronic inflammation bring? It brings a lot of protein. Protein carries a negative charge. Protein is more acidic. And so therefore, when people are inflamed, they're carrying more, the pH is going to go down and they're going to be more acidic. So the carbon dioxide, which is bicarbonate in the blood, acts as a buffer against this inflammation to try to keep that pH in the best possible place so that nutrients can go into the cells, waste products can come out, and everything works better when the pH is perfect, right? So if you see a patient that has a low carbon dioxide, one of the common reasons is that they're chronically inflamed, and this buffer system is simply fatiguing. The buffer system is simply fatiguing. That can be one of the causes, I say one of the more common causes of a low CO2. I just talked about a high CO2, carbon dioxide. A high CO2 can be from simply not being able to breathe, the lungs, some kind of malfunction there. Now, I want to say one more thing. In the CMP, we're not going to talk about the magnesium serum, but when you look at serum magnesium, you're only seeing about 1% of really what's going on with the magnesium. But nonetheless, we still want to see that magnesium somewhere between 2.1 to 2.4. If you have a magnesium, let's say that's down to 1.8 or 1.9, and you have a CO2 that's low, and you have a chronically inflamed person, it's probably because the buffer system, because remember, not only bicarbonate, CO2 is a buffer, but magnesium also acts as a buffer for an acidic environment as well. So if you have low magnesium and low carbon dioxide, it's a pretty good sign that you're dealing with something with your buffering system is not able to keep up. Okay, so let's talk about some calcium patterns here. All right, I need to just X something out here. Okay, good. So calcium is the most abundant mineral in the body. It's absorbed in the upper part of the small intestine, and absorption and utilization depends on phosphorus and guess what? HCl. So one of the things that we can see is with calcium drifts down, to me, once it gets down to 9.2, 9.1, we're already starting to think about the possibility of low hydrochloric acid. Keep in mind, we always look at patterns. So if you think hydrochloric acid, you want to look back at that form. I have a form that asks, do you have belching and burping when you eat? Do you have bad breath and the things we talked about, bloating immediately upon eating? These can be signs of low hydrochloric acid. So you want to look at that pattern. So anyway, iron along with calcium can only be absorbed in acidic media. Guess what? Proteins can only be, I shouldn't say absorbed, but proteins have to be broken down by HCl. And if you don't have enough HCl, your protein can go low as well. All right, so common causes of increased calcium can be metastasis. So, as chiropractic internists, we're going through this process and we want to be able to evaluate if somebody has metastasis. Keep in mind, we're always looking for patterns. When it comes to cancer, we never want to miss that, of course. But keep in mind, the older a patient gets, the more likely cancer can be present. So in other words, if somebody comes in and they're 40 years old and they have a certain signs and symptoms, I might be less concerned about cancer than if somebody's maybe 75. But keep in mind, people who are 40 can have cancer. So, you don't want to just close your eyes to it. If you see high calcium, and high calcium, by the way, maybe I had it here. The clinical range is usually about 10.1, 10.4, depending on your lab, somewhere in there. If you have calcium that comes in at 10.5, this is probably not metastasis. If it's a little bit elevated, probably not metastasis. When we see metastasis, we'll see the calcium get, north of 11, 11.5, even up to 12. So another reason for it can be hyperparathyroid. So if somebody comes in, they have elevated calcium. Here again, if it's 10.5, it's probably not hyperparathyroid. But if you get around 11, 11.5, you really want to order a parathyroid hormone. And here's how you do it. Somebody comes in, you see that their calcium is 11.5, and your blood work just came in. You or your staff call the lab, because the lab will keep your blood there for 3 or 4 or 5 days. Some things keep better than others, and in case you need to do a call in. So you're going to call in and ask them, can you run a parathyroid hormone on there? And then they can take that blood. That way the patient doesn't have to do, a brand new blood draw, and they can come in there and get that done, and all is good. So if it comes out that it's hyperparathyroid, you work through that. Of course, you work through that issue. If it's not, then you break that out. And another thing that can elevate is going to be inflammation. I didn't talk about vitamin. I'll do that. But inflamed, we usually don't see the calcium go up to 11.5 or 12. But if somebody's inflamed, sometimes you'll see that calcium kind of in that 10.5 to 11 range. You can be in that area. I actually had somebody with high calcium, and that was why they came in. They came in, their chief complaint was, I've been all over the place, I have high calcium, we have no idea why. We went through a lot of things, and I have to tell you, it took a while for us to figure this out. But he had I think he had a fungal, if I remember right. He had a mycotoxin issue. We eliminated or went through a protocol to reduce mycotoxins in his system, and that was the thing that lowered the calcium. So anything that's creating inflammation can do that. Okay, so here's some patterns. You can get these slides if you want them, but here's some patterns to look at. Calcium causes a decrease. Common causes decreased calcium, hypoparathyroidism, vitamin D deficiency, decreased serum protein, pregnancy, and of course, low HCl. Those are big ones. All right, so you can read these. I'll give you these slides. You can read through these. These are patterns to pay attention to when we come to calcium. I do want to go through this one though. If you have an elevated phosphorus and a low calcium, you want to think about gallbladder dysfunction. Here's what I do. I put like these right here and this right here and these numbers right here, this verbiage. You can actually put that and laminate it. And when you look at blood work, especially when you first start doing blood work, look at it. And when you see a calcium that's out of range, look for any one of these patterns to see if they exist. And then, of course, match that with your history and your physical, and then you might find something in there, because I find it very helpful when you see something like this and we're like, oh, okay, we've got some gallbladder dysfunction, because sometimes that might be the only thing you see that gives you a hint to gallbladder dysfunction. Okay, so let's talk about protein patterns. Remember, the liver does a lot of things: fat metabolism, detoxification, carbohydrate metabolism, hormones, storage, immune system. But perhaps the physiologists tell us the most important thing the liver does is protein metabolism. If you can't make proteins on a continual basis from the liver, you can't live over 2 or 3 days. So there's this chronic thing that happens, constant, I should say. Your bones and ligaments and tissues and cells, they're all made of protein. We know that, but keep in mind that the DNA, the genetics, what do the genetics do? Well, if you take a liver cell found in the liver, you have the DNA. Most of that is going to be blocked. You're only going to express those areas of the DNA, the genetics, that are consistent with liver cell. So what's going to happen is when that liver cell gets activated, those genes are going to produce proteins. That's what genes do. They produce proteins. These proteins go into the cell, and that's what makes the cell work. So proteins are very important, but proteins are made up of long chains of amino acids. So they're only going to last so long. They're going to break down. Once they break down, they go to the liver, and the liver makes new stuff out of them, new proteins and even other stuff. Sometimes it'll make sugar if it needs, it'll make other things, whatever it needs based upon the needs of the body at the time. So the liver has a lot to do with it. So when we look at protein, one of the places we're really focusing in is how's that liver doing? Okay, so total protein, most of it's going to come from albumin, globulin, a little bit from fibrinogen, but it's so little that you're not really going to measure. We like to see 7.1 to 7.5. Once it goes below 7.1, you want to think about some things. I think I have some patterns up here for you. Okay, so let's look at this. If you have decreased protein and decreased BUN and altered ALT, it suggests that we've got some liver congestion. We've got some liver function or dysfunction. If you have decreased protein, you have decreased cholesterol, decreased ALT, then you have a hypometabolic liver. I'm going to show you a picture of this just in a second. Okay, so elevated protein, elevated uric acid, altered calcium suggests pancreatic enzyme deficiency. I'm also going to suggest that this suggests that you've got an inflammatory process going on. So if your protein goes north of 7.5 from a functional standpoint, the two most common reasons for that I find clinically that protein goes over 7.5 is going to be dehydration. Person just not drinking enough water. Maybe they're drinking too much Starbucks or whatever the case may be, or they've got an inflammatory process going on. That inflammation could be an infection. That inflammation could come from food sensitivity. That inflammation could come from wherever inflammation is coming from. But these are the two most common drivers of that. Infection is probably the more common of the two, causing an elevated protein. Once you get a protein that's over 8, you got something really bad going on. It could be infection, but it could be worse. It could be some catabolic process, even cancer, and things like this. Okay, so increased protein, dehydration, carcinoma, pneumonia, chronic inflammation, acute or chronic infection. If you see that somebody has elevated protein, you have to figure out why. Here's patterns. Okay, so we're talking about increase. If they have dehydration is the issue, look at the BUN, look at the red blood cells. Also, I don't have it here, but look at the sodium as well, because these will have a tendency to elevate. These will have a tendency to elevate if you have dehydration. Even albumin will elevate. Albumin will elevate as well. It is a protein, but it'll elevate if you're dealing with dehydration. So you want to keep that in mind. So let's take it back. So somebody has a protein that's sitting at 7.8, and I look, BUN looks normal or looks low, and the red blood cells look normal, sodium looks normal, albumin is not elevated. Then I'm not thinking dehydration. I'm thinking inflammation for some reason. The next thing I'm going to look for is there a pattern for infection? Did they, from the history, from the physical, from the other blood analytes, the CBC, the TSH, other things that we look at for infection, are those signs there? And that's how we'd work through that. And then you start identifying why that's there. Okay, so functions of the liver and protein metabolism. So these are, this is what the liver does when it comes to protein. It is deamination of amino acids, formation of urea, this is how we make BUN, and formation of plasma proteins. And here again, if we do not make plasma proteins, you live for about 2 to 3 days, and that's it. Your liver has to be able to make those proteins. Okay, so here's a case. Let's look at the protein is sitting at 6.7. Protein is at 6.7 down here. Calcium is at 9.0 right there. I'm going to say, just looking at that sight unseen, there's a good chance that we have a low HCl because that pattern, goes together there. But also look at that BUN. Remember, BUN is low. When BUN is low, it means that you are not doing this process well. You're not forming urea to detoxify the ammonia. The most common reason is your liver is congested. It's hypofunctioning. If you look at the ALT, we'll look at that in just a minute. The ALT is actually low as well. We like to see it 18 to 26. So that can be a reason for that pattern we're seeing. We've got low HCl, but we also have a hypometabolic liver. We talked about this pattern a while ago, but if you look at the cholesterol sitting up there, we like to see the cholesterol at least 160, 153 is just a bit low. All right, so I think this is just more of that pattern. Let's move on. Okay, there's something called the sign of 88. Now I want to go through this because it's really important. But here's the liver. So your body is made of protein, right? We talked a lot about that. So when proteins break down, they're full of nitrogen. Why? Because amino acids are full of nitrogen. If you leave nitrogen by itself, it's going to float into some hydrogen, and you're going to make ammonia. When you make ammonia, your body has to deal with that. What deals with that? The liver deals with that, and it makes BUN out of it. So, because that's a safer form of nitrogen. Now, ideally, we talked about this in CMP1, we want to see that BUN 13 to 18. So when BUN goes down to 8, I want you to think about this now, okay? When protein goes up to 8, and that's the sign of 88, protein at 8 or above, BUN 8 or lower. So when protein goes up to 8, what does that tell us? That tells us there's a lot of protein flying around. You've got an inflammatory process going on somewhere, and there's a lot of protein that's flying around. But guess what? This protein is not being deaminated. So your liver's not able to keep up with the demand of all this protein flying around. So this person is circling the drain, so to speak. This person is in an inflammatory free fall. So what we want to do is figure out why. The most common reason is infection, but worse things can be there as well. You can see things like cancer or other catabolic processes that can lead to this. If you see somebody has a sign of 88 and there's no other signs that you can see from observation from history or physical, that means that they need to be in the emergency room, then that means that you can develop a strategy. Figure out what it is. Is it an infection? Is it bacteria? Use some vitamin C, use some silver. Is it something else? Usually a virus doesn't do that. Is it something else? Is there some other cause for inflammatory process? Sometimes I've seen that it's not an infection, but we worked with it for 2 weeks and we saw that sign get better, so it was no longer there. We don't know what was going on, but we knew it got better. The more concerned I am about the sign of 88 with a patient because of the pattern presents that, the more likely I'm going to be to repeat this test within a short period of time, maybe 1 week or 2 weeks, just to see what's going on. If it's a sign of 88, but I don't see a lot of clinical reasons for concern, or maybe it's an infection and I know what the infection is, and I've already implemented a protocol, the infection's already getting better, then I'm not so freaked out. I'm not so antsy that I've got to go back and read this again. As long as I know the infection's getting better, I will come back and look at it maybe in a month. So it's going to be relative clinically to what's going on. But the sign of 88, you want to pay attention to that. Okay, so albumin produced almost entirely in the liver, responsible for 3/4 of the colloid osmotic pressure. So when somebody's albumin goes lower than 3.5, this is where a lot of times we'll see they start having edema. You know, they get that pitting edema in the ankles. If they're, in bed, they're going to have it in the sacral area or wherever the lowest gravity point of the body is. Okay. So albumin, this is interesting. There's something when we read blood work that's called ominous signs. Now, ominous signs are ominous because they're bad. When you have an ominous sign, it means that you have something that's very important that you need to pay attention to right now. So it could be cancer, it could be an infection, or it could be some catabolic process. You just need to understand what it is. So it's very interesting. We have 4 ominous signs, and albumin is connected to 3 of those. So when albumin goes below 3.5 or less, it's generally not a great sign. It means something's going on wrong. One of the ominous signs that we'll look at is if you have albumin that's less than 3.5, and you go over to your CBC and you see your absolute lymphocyte count is less than 1,500, this is an ominous sign. So if you see that, that means it's an invitation for you to figure out why that's there. Okay, so okay, that's patterns. Let's move on. I want to go through these ominous signs. So one of the ominous signs we have, one of the four, is a cholesterol that is lower than 120. We talked a little bit about this one before. The most common ominous sign that I see in clinical practice, the first one that shows up is the AG ratio. When the AG ratio goes less than 1, that's not a great sign. That doesn't mean the person's getting ready for a casket, but it does mean that you got to figure out what it is. Is it an infection? Is it a cirrhosis liver? Is it cancer? You know, you have to look for the patterns to see what fits. Another one is the calcium to albumin ratio. When it goes over 2.7, this is an ominous sign. And of course, the one we already talked about. So when I'm reading blood work, I'm going to talk about something practical. When I first look at blood work, the two things I'm going to key in on first before I go anywhere else, I'm going to go straight down and look at that albumin. If that albumin is 3.5 or less, then I'm going to start looking for these ominous signs. If it's not, then I'm not going to worry about the ominous signs. The next thing I'm going to look for is to look at the BUN and protein. What's the sign of 88? So this is something I want to encourage you. When you read blood work, just as a safety measure and to understand, you know, more serious problems. If somebody walks in, rule out the albumin, rule out the sign of 88. Once you do that, you can take a breath. Now look at your blood work, look for patterns, and do what you do. Okay. So here's AG ratio. I'm going to skip through these because they don't really help us a whole lot. So low protein, when it's low, think about malabsorption, low HCl enzymes, and a vegetarian diet. That could be it, or elevated. You want to think about inflammation. Now, I see on my time here, I've got about 8 minutes left. I've got more teaching that I need to do here, so I will continue on for just a few extra minutes here. But I want to show you something real quick. Here's the stomach. In the stomach, you have hydrochloric acid. So these proteins are made up of long-chain amino acids. Whoops, sorry about that. They're made up of long-chain amino acids. I'll get back to where I was. And here's what happens. So these amino acids have bonds and they have particular shapes. HCl, what it does, it breaks these, you know, these long chains. So a protein could be 40 amino acids, 600 amino acids, depends on what the protein is. It's going to break it down in little bitty chunks so that when it gets into the small intestine, your digestive enzyme can take that small chunk, get it to its individual amino acid so you can get it to the liver. So if you have low HCl, you can't break the proteins down into these little bitty chunks, and therefore the small intestine cannot do its job and break it down into individual amino acids. So what happens to a protein? What happens in the GI tract? What happens in the small intestine? What happens in the small intestine when you have a protein that has not been broken down into chunks? It's just this big form of amino acid. You can't do anything with it. It creates an inflammatory process. So that can start with food sensitivities, but maybe not even food sensitivities, maybe just food intolerances, you know, overreaction from the immune system. So it just creates an inflammatory problem. So if you have low HCl, it's a big problem. How about all these people taking proton pump inhibitors? People that are taking proton pump inhibitors are just asking for an inflamed GI. I mean, I don't have time to go through all this, but the HCl, let's just say one thing and I'll move past. The HCl, when it mixes with the food, changes the pH. When the pH is altered, the food bolus becomes acidic, and then it hits the small intestine. Once it hits the small intestine, it radically drops that pH. When you drop the pH in the small intestine, that is what activates the gallbladder to contract and release bile. That's also what activates the pancreas to release the enzymes. So guess what happens good if you don't have HCl below the stomach? The answer is nothing. So it's a big deal. So if you have low HCl, you're going to mess with your pancreatic digestive enzyme production, you're going to mess with your bile flow, and you're going to have more problems. So I just want to encourage you about that. One of the things I really try to do when people are on protein pump inhibitors, first, figure out why they were having the problem and see what we can do to support that problem. And then I want to work through that so that they don't need to take that anymore, because this is a big issue. I mean, to me, this is a huge issue that's not given as much energy as it really needs. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about bilirubin. But first, before we do, I want to look for questions. I can hear you. I can hear you. Slideshow is behind. I apologize for that. Hi, Doc. Question on levels of creatine. Okay, so I will try to answer that maybe on Facebook page. All right, so I have just a couple of minutes left. This has been a very, I mean, we've gone pretty much in depth to looking at these patterns and so on and so forth. I hope you've gotten a lot of great information out of this. I do have some more things to go through. I'm going to try to get through these, but if I do not, then we're going to have a new subject, has to do with blood analysis next month. We're going to have another one. And so, but if I have extra stuff left here, I'll put that in there. We'll make it all work. I want you guys to have a good rounded look at the CMP. All right, so bilirubin, of course, gives the jaundice, or I'm sorry, yellowish appearance to the skin. That's the reason why when it goes high, you have a problem. And remember, we have the total bilirubin is made up of direct and indirect. The direct bilirubin is post-hepatic and water soluble. Indirect is not. So let's look at this. So here's my liver right here. Here's the spleen. Between the spleen and the liver, you have the superhighway called the reticular endothelial system, and it's majorly in the spleen, but it goes all the way to the Kupffer cells in the liver. This reticular endothelial system, what it does, it's your macrophages, specifically in the spleen, specific in the liver. What it does is it looks for like red blood cells that are 128 days old. Now the cell membranes are afraid. You need to get rid of them, or anything, pathogens, microbes, looking for anything that's not supposed to be in the system. This reticular endothelial system will take care of it. Well, when you break down red blood cells in here, you're going to release bilirubin, but this bilirubin is actually fat soluble, and you can't get rid of anything in the body that's fat soluble. So you're including hormones, toxins, and things like this that are fat soluble. So what has to happen is they have to go to the liver, and then the liver is going to make water out of it. Once the liver makes water out of it, then it can go through this hepatobiliary system, through the GI tract, or back through this way, through the kidneys and through the urine. So that's how we get rid of things. So when we look at bilirubin, is it fat soluble? Is it water soluble? A really great way to check is if you do a basic urinalysis dipstick, you can measure bilirubin. If you measure bilirubin and it's high in the urine, you're only seeing the water soluble, so you're actually seeing what's called the direct bilirubin. That's a good way to look at it. But also look at your patterns. There is what's called a prehepatic reason for high bilirubin. There's a hepatic reason for high bilirubin, and there's a post-hepatic reason. The prehepatic reason can be when there's a large amount of hemolysis going on from the spleen. So the spleen is very active at killing red blood cells. This can happen in overwhelming infections, but it can also happen when there's spleen pathology. So, those things, if somebody has an overwhelming infection and I see the bilirubin high, then I'm going to think that at least in part, that could be the indirect. Now, when you run your blood work, you can always ask for direct and indirect, and then you know for sure. But looking at patterns, that would be the prehepatic. The hepatic is the cholesterol and bilirubin get together along with whatever toxins you're getting rid of, maybe used up hormones, toxins from the environment, toxins from the body, add a little bit of salt, and we make bile. And so if you're not doing that well, then you can have an increased level of bilirubin because you're not getting rid of it well. The next phase is you make bile. It comes down here, it stores in the gallbladder, and let's say, given the example I did a while ago, somebody has a low HCl, so their gallbladder is not contracting well, so the bile's not flowing good. Bile's not flowing good, maybe it becomes sluggish, or they even develop gallstones. If that's the case, that can also cause the bilirubin to back up. So if you have elevated bilirubin, the things you want to think about is it coming from the reticular endothelial system hemolysis, usually an overwhelming infection or spleen pathology? Is it coming from the liver's congested and it's just simply not making the bile properly? Is it post-hepatic? Is it the bile is sluggish? So those are things that you want to consider with an elevated bilirubin. If you have a decreased bilirubin, generally I think of terms of congested liver as well as a possibility of a sluggish bile flow. So I think about hepatic and post-hepatic on the low bilirubin. So when we look at bilirubin, we like to see this range here, 0.5 to 0.8. 0.5 to 0.8 is a really nice range for the bilirubin to be in. If it gets 1.5 and higher, that's where you start seeing people kind of go jaundice. Now, that's what they say. My clinical experience has been that you don't really see jaundice happen until it's north of 2.0. So that's what we see. So if somebody comes in and they've got a bilirubin of 3.3, to me, that is a pattern, or you want to look for a pattern of a congested liver or a pattern for gallbladder, the gallbladder being sluggish. Now, if you'll give me just a few minutes, I'm going to go through some very important clinical things to talk about when it comes to bile flow, gallbladder, and these issues. If you'll give me just a couple of minutes, I will do that. Okay, so first, the hepatobiliary system. You make the bile in the liver. It's made up, as I said, it's made up of cholesterol, it's made up of bilirubin, it's made up of, you know, let's say you have estrogen that's in the system, it's fat soluble, it's been used, it comes to the liver. Now your liver is going to convert it into water, it's going to put it in the bile and take it right down that train. You're also, you know, you've been subject to BPA plastics or whatever, that's one of the ways you're going to detox going through the bile. You're going to add some salt because these are going to be bile salts. So ideally it comes down here, it gathers right here, and then we get a good contraction of that gallbladder, and that way we can release the bile salts in the GI tract so that you can absorb fat. A pattern I want you to look for in the blood for somebody having poor gallbladder function, I shouldn't say it that way, poor bile flow. You want to look for a low vitamin D because vitamin D is fat soluble. In my area of Missouri, if somebody's not out in the sun, they're generally, and they don't take vitamin D, they're going to be about 28 to 32. That's what I find. But if somebody comes in and they have a vitamin D of 12, we get a little bit of vitamin D from our diet. What this means is they're not absorbing it. And guess what? If they're low in vitamin D, they're also low in vitamin E, they're low in vitamin A, they're low in vitamin K and essential fatty acids. Now, you may supplement these things, but more importantly, we got to get to the reason why the bile flow is not flowing. So if you suspect sluggish bile flow, look at the vitamin D. Also look at the triglycerides. Are the triglycerides lower than 75? Now, it could be low blood sugar, it could be other reasons, but it could also be sluggish bile, and you're simply not absorbing fat. And of course, you know, low bilirubin is going to be, can be a sign, anything lower than 0.3 that we talked about. So those are some nice little things that you can look at to give you some kind of clinical clue from the blood work. Okay. Now, remember, here's the portal field right here. This is a picture of the liver cells. These are hepatocytes right here, all right? So this is coming from the small intestine. It comes in here. The hepatocytes deal with it. You make the bile comes down here, it collects here, and it goes out that way. It's a pretty cool process. All right, so impaired gallbladder salt synthesis leads to sludge formation, and clinically, here's some of the signs that you can see. You can have bloating and distension, burping after fatty meals, upper back and abdominal pain, chronic digestive complaints. These are clues that you have poor bile flow. If you have decreased salts, it's going to create a microbiome imbalance, and it's going to increase sludge formations. If your liver is unhealthy, it's not going to make the appropriate amount of cholesterol to bilirubin ratio. So what happens is, if your cholesterol is supposed to go in solution to make up the bile. So what happens when this ratio gets off, then the cholesterol becomes insoluble, and that's where you start forming stones, and the bile gets sluggish. Okay, so when a person eats, a hormone known as cholecystokinin is secreted, and that's what causes the gallbladder along with the HCl. Okay, so fairly common disorder is from biliary dyskinesis, in other words, not moving well. It could be from poor vagal function. Remember the brain-gut axis, the vagus nerve. I don't have time as much right now to show you pictures, but we have people say, ah, and I look at the palate. If the palate doesn't raise when they say ah, or it minimally raises, that's the back, the palate. If it doesn't raise, that's an indicator of poor vagal function. If you do the gag reflex and go all the way back to pharynx and you don't get a gag, this is poor vagal function. One of the things that we can do for these people is have them gargle. Also, upper cervical chiropractic care is very good, and if that's a problem, if that's an issue, it's very good for improving vagal function. Cold showers, deep breathing, coffee enemas. There's a bunch of things that you can do. Just look online for vagal activations. That's kind of like the latest hit. You know, 10 years ago, everything was about vitamin D, but now everything's about vagal function, which I'm glad about that. Okay, so let's move on. Biliary sludge, of course, you see that nasty looking thing right there. Gallstones are formed. Okay, these are modifiable risk factors of gallstone disease. Being overweight and obese, losing weight very quickly. I had a patient one time that was in the 200s, high 200s, a lady. She lost about 60 pounds really quick. She came into me because she had some really bad problems going on. And that's what it was. She's developed some gallbladder problems. Being sedentary, not moving. Eating high-fat diet. You got to watch this when people go on a ketogenic diet. If they have poor biliary hepatobiliary function, it can be a problem. So you have to watch that. People, you know, doing bullet coffees, or doing a lot of coconut in their coffees, or, you know, eating a lot of avocados, doing a lot of oils, and they're not used to it, and they have poor hepatobiliary system function. You can do that. High cholesterol diet, low fiber diet, taking medications containing estrogen. Estrogen, by the way, estrogen, let me get back to this right here. If you have poor bile flow from a hormone standpoint, you might have low thyroid function, you might have insulin resistance, or you may have estrogen dominance. Any one of these or a combination of that can cause the bile to be more sluggish. In fact, when we look at patterns, I'm sorry to go all the way around the circle here, but if somebody has poor bile flow, the first thing I think about is, what's the thyroid doing? Do they have insulin resistance? Do they have an estrogen problem? That's going to be the first of my pattern look, if you will. Okay. When somebody fills out the form, this is our intake form. If they come in and they're, you know, circling, you know, 2 or 3s on a bunch of these, I already know before I see the patient, we could be dealing with a bile flow problem. Of course, you know, you're going to palpate right there. Blood lab patterns. Here's some patterns I want to put together for you. Elevated depressed bilirubin, elevated cholesterol, altered ALT, AST, elevated alkaline phosphatase, GGT. I'm going to finish in just a couple of minutes and I'll be done. I just want to give you these clinical pearls. I'm going to try to finish by 8:10. Gallbladder rescue. Gallbladder attacks frequently happen late at night. They can follow a heavier fat meal. They can present with nausea, abdominal pain, chest pain, vomiting. Something that we have used, my granddad used in the 50s, my dad used, you know, from the 60s on to his time that he worked, that he saw patients, and I've used very successfully. If somebody's having a gallbladder attack and they think, I've got to get to the hospital right now, we use a product from Standard Process called disodium phosphate. And here's what we do. You take 6 capsules. Now, you must do it this way or it will not be as effective. You want as hot a water as you can stand, about 1 or 2 ounces. That's all you need. Just an ounce or 2 of water, maybe 3. You're going to take 6 capsules. You're going to open the capsules, put the powder in the drink. Now, how I do it, I put the powder in the water. I put the powder in the glass first, and then I put hot water, and then start as vigorously as I can and have them throw it back. You're going to take 6 capsules, and you want to get it the powder, not the capsules. Don't take the capsules because it releases in a different place of your stomach and GI tract. It doesn't work as effective. Take the capsules out, take 6 of them. You're going to put it in a glass, pour some hot water in there as hot as you can stand, don't burn yourself. Stir it up real quick. It doesn't stir good, and just throw it back, get it into your system. Sometimes people will throw it up right immediately, and then the gallbladder feels better. Sometimes it takes 10 or 15 minutes, and maybe they'll go from a 10 down to a 6 or a 7 or 3 or 4. Have them lie on their left side and gently massage the gallbladder. Those are things that you can do. All right, here's lifestyle. Increased vagal activity, of course, so you get better contraction. I want to go on to, here's some causes we've already talked about. Lifestyle strategies, diet. There you go. Decrease fat and oils, decrease fried foods, decrease carbs because of the insulin, decrease sugars, drink coffee if they like it. If they don't have them do it. 30 minutes of vigorous exercise. Medications. So here's some medications that can cause problems. So you want to see if they're on these medications because it could actually be working against you trying to rescue. Coffee intake, vagal activators. I'll give you these slides. Here's some things you can do for vagal activation. Nutraceuticals. Okay. So if somebody's having hepatobiliary, I like using beetroot extract. We get that beta TCP from Biotics. I like to use vitamin C powder. These are kind of my go-tos. I like to use those. Something that's a little bit more, that will break up the gallstones more aggressively is bile salts, but we don't want to use those. I don't use those in the beginning. And the reason why is because sometimes people can have side effects from those that are not desirable. You don't want people staying on bile salts forever because there are links to bile salts and cancer and so forth like that in long-term uses. Of course, these are things that promote gallbladder contraction. So here's just some things that you can look through when you see that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here and let's see if we have any more questions. Okay, so I do have a question here. And okay, if you have hypokalemia due to hyperadrenals, would that be coupled with increased sodium? It can be, but there's other things that can move the sodium around, but certainly it can be. It's a good observation. Okay, very good. Now, do you guys have any more questions? If you do not have any more questions, I'm going to close this out and I'm going to say thank you guys so much for participating. We had a whole bunch of people on tonight. I hope you got a lot out of this. Thank you for being a part.